Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a weird video that was tweeted out by none other than Evil Universe me, Eric Hovind. I feel like I ignore way too much of his stuff considering that his name is an anagram for Vice Rhino. Proof that he's a fake, I guess. He chose his creationist name specifically to be a parody of my name. How rude. Anyway, let's go.
In order to be a true scientific theory, creationism would have to be falsifiable and have predictive power.
Yep, it sure would. If something is unfalsifiable, that also means it is unverifiable. So if you can't tell me what would prove your idea wrong, that means it also can't be proven correct. Falsifiability is very important in science. When someone develops a new hypothesis, in order to be taken seriously, they have to lay out exactly what observations or measurements or what have you would demonstrate their hypothesis to be wrong. Then, as these observations and measurements are taken, they can be used to either support or refute the hypothesis. If you are unable to tell me specifically what would demonstrate your hypothesis to be wrong, then you can keep rationalizing why your hypothesis is correct instead of the competing hypotheses, even if there is no evidence that points specifically to your hypothesis. Evolution is definitely falsifiable. The problem that creationists often have with it now is that so many of its tests of falsifiability are in the past, and it has passed all of these tests. So a creationist looks at the state of the theory of evolution today and declares it to be unfalsifiable, because there are very few future tests that anyone could think of that would actually demonstrate evolution to be incorrect in the face of the piles of evidence that today do support the theory of evolution. But any of these pieces of evidence once had the potential to falsify it should it have pointed in a different direction. But they didn't. As far as predictive power goes, if something doesn't have predictive power, then it is functionally useless. The whole point of science is to improve our understanding of how the universe works. We do that by testing predictions. If X is true, then Y will also be true. We don't know how to directly test X yet, but we know how to test Y, and Y is true. So that supports the idea that X is also true. Again, evolution meets this requirement. Evolution has been used to predict which geologic strata we would find specific fossils in. It predicts that animals isolated on islands will appear closely related to those on the closest mainland. It predicted that Precambrian fossils would be found. It predicted that we would find fossil series like equine evolution, cetacean evolution, and hominid evolution. Evolution predicts that useful features will evolve independently and that these independent iterations will have the same function but will have fundamentally different structures. For instance, cephalopod eyes and vertebrate eyes being wired essentially opposite from each other. And there are more. Evolution has been used to make many predictions in the past and is still being used to make predictions today. So evolution meets both the requirements of falsifiability and predictive power. But does creationism? Is creationism falsifiable? Well, that depends on what you mean by creationism. Certainly, Eric's version of creationism is falsifiable. Young Earth creationism is based entirely on the idea that evolution did not happen, and that the Earth cannot be older than about 10,000 years at the oldest. So what would falsify it? Well, if it could be demonstrated that either the Earth is older than 10,000 years, or that evolution has occurred, then that would falsify young Earth creationism. And I think Eric would agree with that. The disagreement comes over whether or not it has already been falsified by the demonstration that the Earth is in fact old and the fact that evolution is a fact. But does creationism make predictions? Again, I would contend that it does. It predicts that the relationships between living organisms would be limited. It predicts that the oldest rock should be less than 10,000 years old. It predicts that the oldest living organism would be less than 10,000 years old. It predicts that no sign of human civilization would be more than 10,000 years old. Okay, so evolution and creationism are both falsifiable and make predictions. So they both must be science, right? Not quite. Something like evolution or creationism becomes a scientific theory when its predictions hold true, and they fail to be falsified after being tested. It's not just the making of predictions or the ability to falsify something that makes it science, it's whether or not it passes these tests. Now, certainly something could be called science if it meets these two criteria, but it has not yet been tested. But here's where the problem comes in for creationism. It has been tested. It has been falsified, and its predictions have failed. The Earth is demonstrably older than 10,000 years, and evolution demonstrably happens. But the main problem here comes from the reaction of the people who hold to young Earth creationism: denial. They deny the preponderance of evidence that has demonstrated that their pet hypothesis is incorrect, and they refuse to change their minds based on reality, preferring instead to try desperately to discredit evolution rather than present evidence to support creationism, because before evidence in favor of creationism can even be considered relevant, you must first demonstrate that creationism has not been falsified. This is where it ceases to be science. A good scientist will be willing to admit when they are wrong and will update their views to conform to reality. But sure, scientists are human, so sometimes you do see situations where someone will be found supporting a fringe idea because they've invested so much into that idea that they can't bear that it might be wrong, but in any field, this behavior is considered bad science and is discouraged.
Because it has neither, it must be thrown out of the scientific community.
Nope, it's because it and its predictions have been falsified, so at this point insisting that it's true in spite of the fact that it has failed the scientific test makes it unscientific. Also, side note, the way you're holding your imaginary pipe there makes it look like you're smoking an asthma inhaler rather than a pipe. You'd think creationists would be better at playing make-believe than that.
Welcome to questions at creationtoday.org. I'm Eric Hovind. Mateo writes in and asks, YEC, which means young earth creationism, needs to be falsifiable and have predictive powers in order to have any use as a scientific theory.
Yep, and as I stated, I actually believe that it does. It's just that it has been falsified and its predictions have failed.
What predictions does the YEC model make that the standard model doesn't make? And how can we test them?
And this part of the question is where Eric enters his catch-22, because the young earth creationism model has made several predictions that are unique to it. So Eric could, instead of being condescending, point out those predictions. Except for the problem that all of those predictions have failed, so that would require Eric to abandon young earth creationism, and it's hard to change your mind on a position when your income requires you to hold that position.
What possible piece of evidence would falsify YEC?
If I were to just pick out one thing, it would be radiometric dating. The fact that we can date zircon crystals to 4.4 billion years old demonstrates that the Earth is not young. Take the Y out of YEC, and you're left with old Earth creationism and theistic evolution, which Eric doesn't like for some reason or another.
Well, Mateo, thanks for asking. Here's your answer. And for everyone else hearing, I want to know if you agree or disagree in the comments.
Yeah, right. Like you're gonna have an unrestricted comment set. What? Credit where it's due, man. You allowed comments on this video. And after reading through them, they seem to overwhelmingly agree. Creationism is not scientific. So the facts are on the side of creationism not being scientific, and now it seems popular opinion agrees.
But please, hear me out on this first, okay?
That's what I'm here for. Though, to be fair, I did have 2 full pages of notes within the first 10 seconds of your video, so I might have jumped the gun a bit. 1 minute in, I'm on page 4 of my notes, and Eric hasn't even started answering the question. Will it get better or worse as it goes on? I actually have no idea at the moment, as this is one that I'm scripting on the fly, so I haven't seen to the end yet.
It is important to note that YEC, a young earth creation, is not merely a scientific model, but rather, much like the evolutionary dogma or evolutionism, is a historical model.
And that's how you know he's talking out his ass. He can't just answer the question as to whether or not it's scientific. He has to first redefine what is meant by the word scientific so that his completely non-scientific model might be able to eke by on a technicality if you don't catch him in the deception.
It intends to tell us about the past. And just like evolutionism, it doesn't give us scientific principles which are intended to be applied to medicine and technology.
Except evolution has given us principles that are regularly applied in medicine and technology and agriculture and more. Having an accurate understanding of how things work allows us to create useful new technologies and processes across multiple fields. That's kind of the whole point of science. But in this statement is the implicit admission that creationism has not provided us with anything useful, so thanks for that.
Creation and the events in Genesis are the events in the past which cannot be directly observed or tested today.
No, they can't, but just because you can't directly observe or test something doesn't mean you can't indirectly observe or test a thing. For instance, if Mrs. Rhino bakes some cookies, and then the cookies go missing without anyone seeing who took them, then I can look for evidence left behind by the cookie thief. Of my 3 kids, one has chocolate smeared all over his hands and face. There are crumbs in his favorite hiding spot. He has a history of sneaking cookies. I called over our local forensic team and they found his fingerprints on the cookie jar. His DNA is on the crumbs in his hiding spot. My other 2 children both have solid alibis. None of this is a direct observation or test. It is all indirect, but would anyone doubt that he was the cookie thief? Evolution stole the cookies is what I'm talking about. And at this point, the evidence points overwhelmingly to evolution having stolen the cookies. And the creationists are the kids explaining away each piece of evidence individually with stories that don't really match up. Why is there chocolate on your face? Because my brother who really stole the cookie rubbed it on my face before he ate it. Why isn't there chocolate on his face? He washed up before we got caught. Why didn't you wash up? Because he pinned me down and stopped me from washing up. But you're bigger than him. How could he stop you? My sister helped. Well, why did she help? I don't know, but she did. Why were your fingerprints on the cookie jar? Oh, it almost fell over, so I caught it and saved it. Any parent knows the stories kids can tell to try and avoid getting into trouble. So we can conclude that the chocolate-smeared child was the one who stole the cookies. Additional evidence could change our picture of exactly how this child stole the cookies, but the evidence still points to him being the thief. It is possible that he can be exonerated by some piece of evidence that explains how all the other evidence points to the child when it wasn't actually him, but that evidence would have to be incredibly strong in order to overturn all of the evidence that implicates him. For instance, if I were to come forward and confess that I told him to take the cookies as long as he got some for me too, that would be pretty powerful evidence of that child's innocence. But even then, the child still took the cookies, so the evidence has not been overturned. Another actor has just showed up and confessed to their guilt. That would be theistic evolution, I guess, but in order for that analogy to work, God would actually have to show up at some point. All this to say, evolution stole the cookies, and creationists are making up childish stories to explain away individual pieces of evidence, while hoping that nobody looks at the bigger picture that still points to evolution as being the cookie thief.
Just as Big Bang cosmology and evolutionism are about events in the past which cannot be observed or tested today.
Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, yeah, the Big Bang is in the past, but today we can basically look at a picture of what the universe looked like just after the Big Bang. So to continue my cookie analogy, that would be like having a security camera pointed at the cookie jar, but it didn't start recording until after the kid had grabbed the cookie. So we have a video of the kid, cookie in hand, putting the lid back on the cookie jar and walking away, but we don't have the video of the kid actually taking the cookie out of the jar. And what's more, when the Big Bang was first described, the cosmic microwave background radiation was a prediction. If the Big Bang happened, we should be able to get a picture of the CMBR. We just don't have the technology yet. Well, when the technology was developed, we got the picture. Big Bang Theory made a prediction, and the prediction came true. Evolution, though? That still happens today, and we see it happening today. We see mutations that give their carriers basically unbreakable bones. We see mutations that protect their carriers from heart disease. We have seen speciation events, both in the wild and in controlled laboratory conditions. We have developed a new flu vaccine every year because the flu keeps evolving to a point where the older vaccines are ineffective against it. So creationism and the Big Bang are both historical, whichever one is true. Hint, it's the one that made accurate predictions. It happened in the past and is not happening today. But evolution definitely is continuing on today. It is not some process that just stopped once we described it.
That said, it is possible to examine both of these historical models using modern science.
Yes, it is. And we have. And evolution is guilty of having happened. Creationism wants to be guilty, so it keeps on making up silly childlike excuses as to why it's guilty, but it's not. It is completely innocent of having happened in reality.
For instance, evolutionism demands that DNA and the first cells created themselves, with no designer.
Just because you word it awkwardly does not mean that it's not possible. I mean, physics demand that the specific and complex arrangements of snowflakes crystals create themselves with no designer. That sounds just as ridiculous, but we see it happen every winter. Just because you can word something in a way that makes it sound goofy does not make that thing false. I mean, I could refer to creationism as a magical man in the sky saying an incantation that poofed everything into existence, and I'd actually be closer to an accurate representation of your position than you are of mine. But that still wouldn't make your position false just because I said it that way. I would have to bring evidence that runs counter to the predictions made by your model, and since such evidence exists in abundance, all of your work is still ahead of you, even if you can honestly say that we're not entirely sure how life began. Because, you know what? We're not entirely sure how life began, but we're not going to figure it out by positing an incantation as the solution. That actually is an untestable hypothesis.
Whereas creation says all of life was made by God.
But how did he do it? What mechanisms did he use? Can we further our understanding of how the universe works if we investigate the mechanisms that God used to make life? Or is that statement just supposed to stand on its own as the answer? Because that's not a very useful answer.
The predictions of evolutionism would be that it is possible, given the right conditions, that DNA could write itself.
Awkward wording aside, it would not necessarily have to be DNA. I don't think that DNA can catalyze its own replication. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think it can. But I do know that RNA is able to do that. This has been known since 1982. This is why the RNA world hypothesis is the leading hypothesis when it comes to abiogenesis. RNA can behave like a protein in several scenarios, so with RNA you don't have to have the simultaneous development of proteins and genetic material. So let me reword this a bit. Prediction of abiogenesis. Genetic material, given the right conditions, can catalyze its own replication. Prediction status? Confirmed.
And the first living cell could come together by chance and go from dead matter to a living, self-replicating cell.
First, I'll get the pedantry out of the way. In order to be dead, something must first have been alive. And just in time for Halloween, here's a creepy little fact for you. You are made of dead matter because of digestion. Everything you eat ends up dead and broken down into its component parts, which are then repurposed to make, well, you. So we are all reanimated dead matter. And second, you've got a lot of different steps and predictions bundled into one there, some of which have been confirmed and some of which are still inconclusive. So, prediction. Abiotic synthesis is possible. Abiotic synthesis is the formation of molecules that are used by life under pre-life conditions. So that would be like amino acids. Prediction status? Confirmed. Abiotic synthesis has been shown to be possible in all sorts of different conditions, from early Earth conditions to the modern-day oceanic lithosphere to the cold depths of outer space. Next prediction, organic macromolecules can be formed from these abiotic molecules in early Earth conditions. Prediction status? They definitely can be formed from the abiotic molecules, that is not in doubt, but we haven't quite figured out the exact mechanisms that it would have happened on the early Earth yet. So this one is partially confirmed, but I'll mark it as inconclusive just to be generous. Next comes the formation of protocells, phospholipid bilators encasing material in such a way as to behave like living cells without actually qualifying as alive. This has been demonstrated to not only be possible, but incredibly easy under several different potential primordial conditions. So prediction status? Confirmed. So your one prediction actually breaks down into 4 predictions, and these 4 are very oversimplified. It could be broken down much further, but of these 4, 3 are confirmed, while the 4th we essentially know at this point is possible. We just haven't figured out what conditions would have been like that allow for the necessary reactions. So far, it's looking pretty good for abiogenesis, but even if it weren't, evolution is still a thing. How life started doesn't matter. The fact is that it did start, and it gets simpler the further into the past you go, showing an evolutionary trail. How the first cell came about is ultimately irrelevant when discussing the larger picture of evolution. The fact is that it did come about, and then it evolved.
Biblical creation would predict that life would show signs of intelligent design. It was created by God. Irreducible complexity, created in fully formed and functioning ways.
Okay, so the prediction of creation is that some biological structures or functions will be irreducibly complex. I can agree that this would be a prediction. You shouldn't be able to find the evolutionary development of a feature that didn't evolve, after all. Unfortunately for creationists, this relies on negative evidence. So rather than showing something positive that suggests a creator, it's a game of if you can't figure out how this thing could have evolved, then it couldn't possibly have evolved. As if humanity's understanding of a process somehow had any bearing on the possibility of that process. In most cases, when creationists have put forth something as being irreducibly complex, it has turned out that we actually have a pretty good picture of how that particular feature evolved. like the flagellum. It has been heralded by creationists all over the place about how it is irreducibly complex, but we actually do know how it evolved. I'm not going to get into it here, but I will leave links to Jackson Wheat's Evolution of the Flagellum video and Tony Reed's How Creationism Taught Me Real Science episode on the flagellum if you're interested. So, prediction status? Inconclusive, likely inaccurate, and ultimately unfalsifiable, because even if you can find something for which we cannot discover an evolutionary lineage, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have one.
And have information, a pre-programmed set of instructions given by the creator so that it could work.
First and foremost, if I grant that this is indeed a prediction made by the creation model, the evolution model also predicts that there will be genetic information that's used to pass down character traits. So both models predict the existence of genetic information, and genetic information does exist. So in order to differentiate the models, in this instance we have to go deeper. What would we expect the information to look like? Well, in an evolutionary model, we would expect there to be similarities in the information shared between different organisms, and that the closer two organisms are related to each other, the more similar the genetic information would be. The information would also be a jumbled mess, as the random genetic mutations are subject to non-random selection pressures over time. We would expect to see a lot of information that doesn't make sense. Broken genes, large swaths of material that don't do anything, post hoc fixes to problems that were not anticipated by previous changes that stuck around, things like that. Creation predicts that the information would be efficient, ordered, and logical. There would be similar genetics between related organisms, but since not all organisms are ancestrally related, there should be little to no similar genetics in organisms that are not similar. So what do we find when we look at genetic material? We find a jumbled mess with shared genetics that match up pretty closely to what evolutionary relationships we would expect based on morphology. So go ahead and add one more prediction that is confirmed in the evolutionary model, and this one is not just inconclusive for the creation model, but demonstrated to be woefully inaccurate.
Now, which model's predictions fit the observations and the facts that we know today?
Let's do a quick recap. On evolution and abiogenesis side, we have genetic material can catalyze its own replication. Confirmed. Abiotic synthesis is possible. Confirmed. Organic macromolecules can be formed from abiotic molecules in early Earth conditions. Inconclusive. Protocells can form. Confirmed. Genetic phylogenies would match closely with morphological phylogenies. Confirmed. On creation side, we have irreducible complexity, inconclusive, and unfalsifiable. Genetic information will be independent of morphological phylogenies. Incorrect. And genetic information will be efficient, ordered, and logical. Incorrect. Looks to me like evolution is winning.
Consider the simplest cell you can imagine.
A jail cell with a simpleton in it. Gotcha. I'm actually skipping this because firstly he describes what is not the simplest possible cell, and most of it I covered earlier when discussing abiogenesis. Stuff like RNA acting as its own catalyst and behaving like a protein and whatnot. Most of it is stuff that we understand exactly how it could have happened in a prebiotic Earth, we're just not sure how it all got put together.
And also remember that the moment before the cell came to life, this collection of matter was just dead chemicals which didn't live or move or eat or replicate.
Nope, that is not how chemicals work. Stuff can move without being alive. It is hypothesized that metabolism actually developed before the cell, so that counts as eating. There wasn't a hard, solid line between living and non-living. It's a gradient. In fact, even if we do figure out exactly how abiogenesis happened one day, there will still be a debate as to which stage represents the first stage that could be truly called alive.
Now, it should be obvious from even a grade school level look at cells and genetics that every living cell is a masterful work of engineering.
Yeah, but you're still in the section where you're talking about the simplest possible cell. The simplest possible cell is RNA encased in a phospholipid bilayer. That's not a masterful work of engineering. Even modern cells are not masterful works of engineering. Just the fact that an organism's entire genome is contained in every cell except for a select few specialized types is a demonstration that the cells are not masterfully engineered. That's a lot of wasted resources going to maintaining code that does nothing. It's inefficient. It would be much better and much less resource intensive if each type of cell only had the genetic material that it needed to do its job. Like, We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. It would make more sense if the information in these chromosomes was arranged by cell type, and then a mechanism during embryonic development could make it so that cells only contain the chromosomes that they need to perform their function. So all cells in the body would only have one pair of chromosomes, except for the sex cells. But for this to work, the information would have to be organized efficiently first, and it's not. It's more of a jumbled mess, almost as if the development of new features were happening by slightly changing existing genetic material rather than starting fresh. You know, like we'd expect from a process like evolution.
It requires a brilliant designer.
A brilliant designer who designed everything in such a way as to make it look like it evolved, but wants you to believe that it did not evolve. Good joke, God.
Atheists on social media like to pretend that the creation position is, I don't know how it works, so God must have done it.
I mean, that's certainly what it looks like. In this video, you brought up irreducible complexity, an argument that, by its very nature, is an argument from ignorance. We don't know how this particular structure, function, feature, whatever, evolved, therefore it couldn't have evolved, therefore God did it. I have never seen a creationist even attempt to explain any mechanisms that God might have used during creation. Not once. He is said to have spoken everything into existence. That's literally how magical incantations work. So the irreducible complexity argument boils down to, we don't understand this very specific aspect of evolution, therefore everything was created by a magical incantation.
But the truth is, because we know how it works, and because we know the laws of physics and chemistry, we know God must have done it.
How arrogant do you have to be in order to assume that you know enough about everything to determine that something is impossible without magic? That's literally what you just said. We know how everything works, and because we know how everything works, if we haven't figured out something yet, it must be magic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what your argument looks like to me.
Evolution requires the violation of all kinds of known and testable laws of physics, chemistry, biology, not to mention basic probability.
I hope you have some evidence for that, because it sounds like you're just arguing against evolution based on your ignorance of how stuff works. Like when you say it goes against the laws of physics, the only thing I can think of that you might be talking about are the laws of thermodynamics. And if you think evolution violates the laws of thermodynamics, then that just shows that you don't understand thermodynamics. Not sure what chemical laws you're talking about. I mean, technically thermodynamics could be under the umbrellas of both chemistry and physics. The most fundamental concept in chemistry is the conservation of mass, which actually boils down to thermodynamics again. That's the whole balancing chemical equations stuff that everybody loved so much in high school. For biological laws, you're probably referring to the law of biogenesis, which isn't a problem for evolution and doesn't apply to abiogenesis. Basically, the law of biogenesis was the refutation of the idea of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation was the idea that fully formed, complex life could arise by feeding off the life force leaking out of a dead creature. That's why maggots show up on meat if you leave it out long enough. They pop into existence by leeching off the life force from the meat. So the law of biogenesis is that fully formed complex life comes from other fully formed complex life, not from a mystical life force. Evolution follows the law of biogenesis no problem, and abiogenesis doesn't deal with complex life, but with the transition from simple lifelike chemical reactions to what would be considered the first simple life. But I'm actually putting words in your mouth here based on my previous knowledge of creationist arguments. Maybe you're going to give us something new, although more than likely you're just going to continue on as if you've actually said something meaningful.
I mean, information only comes from a mind, not from random chance.
There has to be a mind in order to interpret something as information, but that doesn't mean that the information has to originate from a mind. I mean, for fuck's sake, you can find videos and audio clips all over the place of various random data from all sorts of sources turned into musical information. You can go to a SoundCloud page right now and find an entire catalog of music that was created by interpreting the microfluctuations in voltage of different types of fungi into musical information. In fact, they had a display set up at the Ontario Science Centre this summer where you could add human microfluctuations into the mix with the mushrooms. So here's a sound clip of the music of my kids' voltage fluctuations combined with the mushroom voltage fluctuations. That's just random noise, interpreted in a way that makes it sound like information. No mind created these microfluctuations. They are still happening even if nothing is listening to it at the moment. Genetic information is information in the same way that this is. It's simply chemical reactions. We can, to a certain extent, know the results of these reactions, and we can represent some of the chemicals with letters and call it information because of how we can interpret it. But it's ultimately just chemistry.
DNA is a language system full of information, just as the operating system in a computer is.
DNA is not a language system, nor is the machine code for a computer operating system, though certainly the analogy of language is closer for machine code than it is for DNA. But in computing, the same instructions will always have the same results unless there is something wrong with the hardware. But with DNA, the same instructions can have a different result depending on the chemicals that are in close proximity to the DNA, because DNA is not a language, it's a chemical, and it works by chemical reaction.
Cells are complex systems of independent machines like an automated car factory or the space shuttle. And a single cell is more complex than anything ever built by man, including the space shuttle.
I guess that depends on how you're defining complexity, but I would suggest that part of the reason for that is that when human engineers work, they are attempting to find the simplest solution to a problem. The more complex something is, the greater the chance that something will go catastrophically wrong. So when performing complex tasks, like going to space, a certain amount of complexity is going to be necessary, but the engineers are actively working to keep things as simple as is practical, because simplicity is good design. Cellular complexity is one of those things that is actually an argument against creationism, as they are way more complex than they need to be in order to do their various jobs, which is an indication of bad design, or lack of design.
So the idea that information in DNA and cell formation was able to violate testable and established laws of science for millions of years until they came to life is absurd.
Yes, it is absurd. Good thing that's not what anybody is claiming.
The more we learn about the universe, and especially the world of living things, the more we see that the only reasonable explanation is God, a brilliant, masterful designer that brought everything into being just as he describes in his word.
There you go. At best, this is Eric explaining why he thinks we don't understand the origin of life, and concluding with God because we don't understand it fully yet. Just because you can go into a little bit of detail about what it is we don't understand, does not mean that inserting God there is not the God of the gaps. Also, the details you're providing are wrong anyway, so if you don't even know what it is that we haven't figured out yet, can you really jump to God as the conclusion? Remember when you said,
Atheists on social media like to pretend that the creation position is, I don't know how it works, so God must have done it.
That's exactly what this is. We don't know how it works, therefore God. That is a useless answer because even if God did do it, it doesn't explain how God did it. And I'm sorry, but creationists have never advanced any knowledge from their study of creationism. The only thing creationists do is attempt to poke holes in theories that falsify creationism without putting forth any explanations of their own. Saying God is not an explanation.
Now, there are many other arguments and evidences that show that the universe was made by God, and there are many more which show that it was made as described in the Bible. Obviously, we've only touched on one facet of the case for creation. But to the follow-up question, what possible piece of evidence would falsify young earth creation? Well, if Jesus returns and tells us we're wrong, then I would take him at his word since he was there when it happened at the beginning and I wasn't.
So the only thing you can think of that would falsify creationism is if a god were to appear and tell you that it wasn't true. Really? You don't see how that makes it unfalsifiable? In order to be falsifiable, you'd have to be able to actually test it. Since Jesus doesn't appear to operate based on our requests, that makes it untestable. Do better, Eric. If you want to claim creationism as scientific, you need to explain what scientific test could be used to falsify it. You can even use some of the suggestions that I made at the beginning of my video if you like.
But in terms of arguments and evidence from science that would disprove creation, well, I guess it wouldn't actually disprove creation, but I suppose you could prove evolution to be possible.
Come on, buddy. You know, if you have to start with the caveat as to why this would not falsify your hypothesis, then it isn't something that would falsify it. If you want creationism to be scientific, you have to lay out exactly what would falsify it. Would evolution falsify creationism? If yes, then creationism is falsifiable. If no, then why bring it up when discussing falsification criteria? That's basically it for this one. He then goes on a rant about how you'd supposedly have to prove all of science wrong in order to demonstrate the possibility of evolution, which seems a bit odd given that 97% of scientists accept evolution. You'd think more scientists would have noticed that evolution defies all of science. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Jose Raul Capablanca, who says, "It does not say in the Bible how many of each animal is taken on board the ark. This fool should read the book that he professes to base his unshakable faith upon. Incidentally, the number of commandments in that book is not 10 either. Good critique of the foolish cherry-picking nonsense, Mr. Rhino." Thanks for the compliment, but just a couple of corrections in your comment. The Bible does say how many of each animal is taken on board. In Genesis 6, 19, and 20, it specifies 2 of every sort of animal: birds, animals, and creeping things. 2 of each. And then in Genesis 7, 2 through 3, it is again 2 of every animal, but 7 pairs of clean animals and 7 pairs of all the birds. See if you can spot the problem with that. And yes, the commandments in Exodus 20 that are often listed as the 10 commandments have way more than 10, but there is a break at the end of the first 10, so it stands to reason that those are the more important ones, but they are never actually called the 10 commandments in the text, only by titles added on by various translations. The ones that are actually called the 10 commandments by the text of the Bible itself are found in chapter 34, and they are the ones that have important and timeless rules such as not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk and making sure you celebrate the Feast of Weeks. Links for social media are in the description. Consider becoming a patron for early access to my videos, and also, I've had a shirt designed specifically because of this video about evolution stealing the cookies, so go check that out on Teespring, and remember, patrons get Teespring discounts. See you next time!